conscious of my own effort to try to represent God's ideas behind this as accurately as we can. And so there are lots of difficult areas, and I invite you to challenge anything that you hear and to test it, and to also correct me if you think that I missed something. Okay, so we are in lesson 2. Just a quick recap. This is the structure of the book. Very simple, symmetrical structure. We're going to continue in the first part, but we're actually in chapter 2, the beginning of what you might call the speeches, the discussion between God and Satan that's taking place, our window behind the veil of the spiritual world, and we see things happening there that we aren't aware of ordinarily, but we may presume, I think, that there are still those kinds of things happening in the spiritual world. We looked at Job's life before, and we talked about his character as described by God himself. This is God who has authored these words, the Holy Spirit, authoring these words and describing Job as blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. And we said last week that these are really 4 different ways of looking at Job's uprightness and integrity. And it's important because one of the themes of Job is the idea that whether a man's integrity can be judged by his life circumstances. That's one of the themes. And we're going to see some different ideas presented in the discussion backward and forward between Job and his friends on that particular theme. And then we looked at the idea of his status in terms of his material blessing, and the family that he has, wonderful blessings of children, great wealth in relation to his own time and circumstances. He would be a wealthy man by our standards even today, as we talked about last week. I made this estimate for what today's value might be for the wealth of this man. And why was this important to the story? What did we say last week?
He was the greatest man in the East.
Yes, he was. Why is it important to the story that that's the case?
He loses.
Yes.
Everything.
A lot of this book is about loss. It's about how loss is interpreted by us when we lose, and by other people when we see other people losing. And so that's another theme of the book, loss, dealing with material loss. And we also talked about Job and his concern for his children. His integrity is illustrated by the fact that he recognized the potential for sin. What kind of sin from his children?
Their hearts.
Yes. They had perhaps cursed God in their hearts. He had a sense of the inner man and the purity of the inner man, not just the outward actions of a man. Just another illustration of his integrity. And then we talked about God and Satan in conversation, and we talked about this somewhat unusual idea that Satan, this evil being, is in the presence of God. He's before the Lord. He goes out from the presence of the Lord, and it's really, I think, undeniable that they are in each other's presence, and the presence of God is in heaven, in a spiritual realm. God asked Satan where he's come from, and he's come from the earth. Again, an implication that he's no longer in a material realm. He's in some kind of spiritual realm. And then I think this is where we got to. We asked the question, who focuses Satan's attention on Job? And who is it? Yeah, it's God himself. We talked a little bit about what might at first sight be a somewhat surprising event, that God is the one who points at Job And we discussed the idea that it might seem surprising only if we presume that this is some kind of bet that God and Satan are having over Job. But instead, if we interpret this as God pointing to Job as a mere mortal, a mere man, and talking about his integrity, his uprightness, his turning away from evil, as an example to Satan of behavior and attitudes and devotion to God that Satan himself might have, then we might look at this very differently. We might see this as God urging Satan to better attitudes, better motivations. By the way, we didn't talk about this, but when we looked at the idea of the sons of God and Satan presenting themselves before God, what does that tell us about the relationship between God and the sons of God and Satan? What did God ask them?
Have you considered my servant Job?
Well, he did, yes. He asked Satan that, but what was the general purpose for their assembly before the Lord?
What you been up to?
Yes. God held them accountable. Spiritual beings are accountable before God. It's interesting to me that even though we have an omniscient, I don't know what omniscience is, omniscient God who knows everything, he is owed a response. He is owed an answer by these spiritual beings, just as we owe God an answer, even though he knows everything about our lives and activities. I just thought that was an interesting observation in passing. All right, so I think we're on the question which says, what do you see in Satan's question? And here it is. Satan answered the Lord and said, Does Job fear God? Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? So, what do you see in that question?
I think it was said last week, but one thing is that he's already familiar with Job, so as we talked about.
Okay.
It being that where God pointed out Job, Satan's already familiar with him.
Satan's already familiar. Certainly we see that.
I think he's challenging God that why would Job fear God if his life had been blessed and not subject to trials?
Okay. Yes, I mean, I think we might say what you just said slightly differently, but it's the same basic idea. It's only because you've blessed him. Isn't that really what Satan is saying? It's only because you've blessed him in the way you have. And not just blessed him, but what else has God done? Excuse me? I'm sorry.
Protected him.
Yes, thank you. Protected him. And how does he say that?
Put a hedge around him.
Yes. And I've noticed in Caleb's prayers from time to time, he'll mention the idea of a hedge around it. It's a biblical idea. Now, I don't know to what extent that is still going on today. We just don't have this window into the spiritual realm where there is a hedge around us. But in one sense, there's a hedge that we can point to in Scripture that we could talk about. What kind of hedge can you think of that's around us? Gage?
God won't let us be tempted more than what we can
Yeah,
do.
that's what I was thinking about as well. There may be some others that you may... Has anyone thought about another one, just out of interest? Okay. But that was the one I was thinking about as well. So, yes, the concept of a hedge still exists. Whether this kind of physical hedge, it appears what Satan is really saying to God is that, there's a hedge around him, his house, all that he has. It's not just his being that's hedged. There's also his possessions, is what Satan is saying. And I don't know whether that's a true statement or not, because you don't know with Satan. Satan is a liar, but if it is a true statement, I don't know if that's still true today. I think possibly, could be, don't know.
Jeremy,
Yes.
I mean, the fact that he asked that or says that means, how'd he know it was there?
Yes.
And so that kind of brings about what God said to him in the first place. You've been down there trying to get over my head, and it didn't work.
Good point. That's a very good point. Something else going on in well, let's say it this way. How would you characterize Satan's question back to God? What type of a question is it as it relates to Job?
I think it's an assumption. I don't know, that's an assumption he's assuming.
All right, an assumption.
It seems like it might try to be a gotcha question.
All right, a gotcha question. Sorry about my hearing.
It's an accusation that he's not serving you to serve you.
Right.
He's serving you to serve himself.
Right. Here, what I would call this is slander.
Yes.
He is slandering the character of Job. We're going to see it's not true. That's why we can call it a slander from our perspective. But how do we also know it's not true from what we've just been reading? Who has described Job's character? Yes. It must be a slander, isn't it? God is speaking truth about Job. So it's a slander. And we're going to see in Job as it unfolds that there is never a time when Job's fear and respect for God is contingent upon his material circumstances. It's never dependent on that. And I think we see here Satan is living up to a description we see of him. We see a description in Revelation and a description of John. In one case, in Revelation 12:10, Satan is described. Someone might remember how he's described there. Charles might remember since we just...
I'm sorry you caught me off guard.
Okay, that's all right.
I apologize.
Are you talking about Peter, as a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour?
Well, no, I'm thinking about in Revelation chapter 12. He is described there as the accuser. Satan is the accuser, and that's exactly what Charles just mentioned a moment ago. He is accusing and slandering at the same time, and as a slanderer, he is effectively a liar. That's what we see in John. These are two descriptions of Satan. Satan is behaving like this in the presence of God.
I see sarcasm, and this is it's disrespect towards God. It's blasphemy.
Yes, and I want to follow up on that point because you're raising a good point there, Mark. In this question about how do you understand God's response, there is a challenge being set forth by Satan against God. Can you see what it is?
If he doesn't have all these things, will he still serve you?
That's basically what Satan is saying about Job. How is that a challenge to God?
Take it all away and see if he still serves you? Take it all away and see if he still serves you?
Well, yes, it is.
You've
That's also
misjudged-
true, but there's...
You've misjudged Job. You are incorrect about why these people actually follow and care for you.
Okay.
Satan's saying that if God doesn't bless people, then people don't see the value in worshiping him.
Okay. Yes, I think we're all warm. Those are all true statements. It's a challenge because God has stated the purity and integrity of Job's character. He's basically saying, God, you you are pointing to this man as an upright man, but you really know that he's only serving you because you've blessed him. It's like, God, you're kind of lying here. You know that there's a reason, and you're pointing him, you're kind of boasting about this man, but really you've got no basis to boast because you've blessed him, and that's the only reason he's serving you, and you know that. That seems to me the challenge. He is basically impugning God's own integrity and honesty about this situation. And he's basically saying, you know, God, that he's only serving you out of self-interest rather than love for you yourself.
I think it's the same attitude that he showed to Eve. He's saying that what God has told you is not true.
Yes, exactly. So who is it that suggests taking all that Job has?
Satan, right?
Yeah. It's not God. God is not the one coming up with this idea and setting in motion this. It's just Satan's idea. It's his idea of the test. And if we see this as not just a kind of a proof of a man's integrity, but also Satan challenging God's integrity and honesty, we can perhaps better understand how it is that God could allow all this to happen. His name, his character, his reputation is being impugned, and before presumably the spiritual hosts. This is I'm imagining this. I mean, the impression is that they come together as a group of angelic beings before God, and Satan is impugning God before all of them. And God is going to defend his character. And to some degree, well, I wouldn't say this, but God chooses anyway to allow these things to happen to Job as part of not just proving Job's integrity, but also proving his own integrity as well through Job's integrity. Does that make sense? I mean, I am not sure. Okay. All right, let's move on to the next question. Unless anybody wants to say anything else about that. So, God allows Satan's challenge. He's allowed to do physical harm. That's Satan's suggestion here, and God just allows that, but he does allow Satan to perform harm, but no physical harm to Job. What does that demonstrate? The fact that God puts a limit on what Satan can do.
It reinforces the idea that God is in control.
Yes, it does. What do we call that?
Sovereignty.
Yeah, I think we call that sovereignty. It's not that God is micromanaging everything that's happening, including all these harmful things that are happening in Job's life. Satan's doing that. And we'll look at that in just a second. But it demonstrates that there's a limit. There's sovereignty over us. I mean, ultimately, what's the ultimate sovereignty over us as human beings? I mean, how does God ultimately limit the kind of evil or free will expression in form of evil that we might commit?
Well, specifically in this case, he says, do what you want, but don't stretch out your hand and touch Job himself.
That's what he says to Job. I'm just asking the question, in our world, as human beings, that sovereignty still exists. What's the ultimate way in which God exercises sovereignty over us?
Limits our lives, like
Yes,
our death.
yes. Yeah, I mean, you can read accounts of evil drug dealers or world despots, and you see their lives, and they seem to have a free rein to commit all kinds of atrocities and evil, but ultimately there is a limit to that. God limits it. There is a sovereignty that exists. It expresses itself perhaps a little differently, but it's over us, it's over Satan. It's encouraging to know that, reassuring to know that. Now, we can't ignore one moral problem with what goes on here. What is the moral problem that goes on here associated with Job being turned over and allowed to do what he wants except harming Job physically? What's the moral problem?
That the children are gonna die,
Yes. And who else?
the servants.
The servants. Now, last week, John pointed out correctly that there's a hint that the children may have been behaving in a moral kind of possibly drunken way, but anyway, feasting and drinking wine is what's talked about in the older brother's house. But that's connected, if you like, with the justice of what God sees here, I don't know. It's hard to know about the servants, though. It seems that we've still got a problem with the servants, who would seem, on the face of things, to be innocent and the victims of what happens through Satan. So, I mean, I'll just give you my opinion about this, and I'd be interested in your opinions. But my opinion is we don't know, and we can only trust that God is going to act justly from an eternal perspective. We can't make any moral judgments about what was going on here on the earth and whether they deserve that kind of fate, or what happened to them subsequently after they died on the earth. Your thoughts on that? Is there any? Yes. Okay.
I think the fact is, when we sin, we're automatically deserving death. And any time that God grants us after that is a gift that He doesn't have to give us. He could strike us down the minute it happened. So it seems unjust to us because we're used to God's patience.
Yes.
But the fact is that unfortunately, they got what we all deserve.
It may well be the case. That's right. Yes.
I don't necessarily know that they were sinning when they were meeting up, because when Job
That's
was
right.
offering the sacrifice, he says it's a secret sin, something they've done in their heart. So those meetups, anytime that I've read it, I've thought of like joyous families getting together and spending that time together.
I agree with you. I think we can't be categoric and just assume it was immoral drinking that was going on, but it's, if that is what was happening, that was my only point.
And my comment last week might have been a bit unfair because it's only a handful of modern translations that use the word heart.
Right. Yes. Well, no, I don't think it's an unfair comment to raise it as a possibility. It's just we can't be very confident about it. Let's. Sorry,
I
Charles.
just want to say one
Yes.
thing, and that when you do that, you're doing exactly what Job's friends begin to do,
Yes.
and try to rationalize what God's doing.
Exactly.
So
Good
you-
point.
You can't.
Good point. All right, let's look at Job's first calamities then. So,
Jeremy?
yes.
One thing I noticed about this when we look at this interaction is that Satan, he couldn't take the blessings of God away without God's blessing.
Yes.
So I think that's just an important point for us to remember, that oftentimes we think bad things happen to us because of Satan, but I think we can read into that and say that Satan can't do it without God's approval.
Yes, indeed. That's actually, I think, something we're going to see. Did you have something more? No. Okay. So, question 3, Job's calamities. We're in these verses 13 to 17. So, let's just quickly recap the calamities. We got oxen and donkeys being taken by the Sabaeans, the people of the Sheba area, and the servants were killed. It's interesting, the servants, the poor old servants, they got it each and every time. We see sheep and servants again burned up by fire from heaven. We see camels taken by the Chaldeans, and their servants were killed. And then the children being killed by a violent wind that collapsed the oldest brother's house. So, what physical blessings, if you like, did not get taken from Job?
His wife.
Okay, his wife. And, well, yes, I suppose that's right. It's interesting. We don't really read about it, so good point.
His barns, I mean, anything that he had at his own location where he was, doesn't seem to be.
Doesn't say anything about that, that's right. Something else.
His health. Still has
Well, at this point, yes. Of course, Satan wasn't allowed to touch him physically at this point.
His friends.
Well, his friends, yes. I was thinking about there are servants, messengers come, a few of them escape this. So he's left with one or two trusty souls who are able to tell the tale. Okay, so let's think about the wife. Why do you think the wife was not taken from Job?
Well, the devil's going to use it, her again.
So we'll talk about that in just a second. What do you think? Could there be a biblical reason?
Flesh of my flesh.
Yes, good point. That's what I was thinking about. Genesis chapter 2:24. The idea that a man leaves his parents, cleaves to his wife, and they become one flesh. And Satan was told not to touch Job's flesh. And could it be that his wife was considered his flesh? I think it's a possibility. I'm just putting it out there as a possibility and an explanation for what you might think of as the somewhat unusual sparing of her, not just because of what we read later on, but also if you think about Satan trying to inflict distress. It's hard for me to imagine much more than taking your own wife. I can speak from experience, and some of you can too. So, that is a possibility there about that. So what's Job's reaction?
Worships.
He does. Did anyone look at that in a bit more detail? How does he worship?
He worships in his morning.
He did. Let's look at what physically he did. What does that mean? What's all of that about?
It's a process of mourning.
Yes, it is. So it's not the only place we see in Genesis. Reuben does something very similar when Joseph is taken.
It seems like he thinks he's next.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't considered that, but possibly he does, yeah. But these are all expressions of grief, mourning, loss. He shaves his head. It's interesting when we come to the New Testament, we talk about women as a shame for a woman to have a shaved head, and she needs to have a covering. There's something about the head and the covering and the hair that seems to have a significance to God. I don't fully understand all of that, but certainly this practice of shaving the head may be some kind of symbolic nakedness before God.
I think it's interesting that, he's worried about the sins that his children might have committed, but yet right here, when he is obviously thinking about what has just happened to him, he does not mention that he may have sinned.
Yes, that's right. And that's a theme we're going to see, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail as the lesson proceeds. So what does Job say? Those are the things he does. What does he say? Well, let me just, before we talk about what he says, there's one other physical thing that we need to talk about. What does he do?
Well, he fell on the ground.
Yes, he falls prostrate before God, which is a very common thing we see in Scripture before the presence of God, or in this case, acknowledging God. And then what does he say?
He gives and he takes away.
Okay, so he recognized that God had given him everything he had, and so God is just and able to take everything he had. But he says something else.
He ends it here with blessed be the name of the
Yes. I want to think about this, because we use that word a lot, I think. What does it mean?
Speak well of.
Well, I think that's how we use it. But here, what does it mean?
The opposite of what the devil tried to get him to do.
Okay, so what is the opposite of what? that Satan wanted him to curse, so what's the opposite? To bless, yes. But what does that really mean?
He's praising the name of the Lord.
What's that?
He's praising the name of the Lord.
Yes, thank you. Yes. The idea of blessing is from a word that means to kneel. To kneel and worship. That's from the Hebrew word. You would probably be familiar with that, but I wasn't. So the idea is that he's not just saying it, he's doing it. he's expressing all this adoration and recognition of God as his Lord and a righteous judge, if you like, but he's also doing it. He's on his knees, he's prostrate before God. So the idea of blessed be the Lord here is not how we use it necessarily, or when we're talking about, have a blessed day or I feel blessed. We're using it differently to how this word means it. To the blessedness really is that God's person and character and reputation be worshipped and praised. That's really what he's saying. God's person and character and reputation be worshipped and praised. Blessed be the Lord. That's what he's talking about here. And he's not just doing it, saying it, as we said, he's on his knees doing it as well. So how does this description compare with with what God said of Job? How does Job's reaction and his behavior compare?
It's exactly as God has described. Jeremy, I wanted to comment a little bit about his being on the ground.
Yes.
And we see Isaiah in his vision, Isaiah 6, that way. We see John in his vision of Revelation. When he's before the Lord, he is prostrate. And this happens to people. This happened to Job. There's a sense in which he's driven. He's doing it of his own volition. But this is something that happens when people experience loss.
Yeah.
I can remember when my dad died.
Yeah.
I was face down on my bed
Yeah.
the whole evening in the dark. And So it's a predictable response, but with what he says, it's definitely his attitude.
It's almost as if God has programmed into our being a kind of an instinct which is triggered when these things happen. It's it's like if someone hit you on a part of your body, you reach for it or you try it. You just have an instinct about certain reactions when things happen, and this seems to be like a spiritual, emotional reaction that we're programmed in to have.
I think this where Satan says he will surely curse you if you do these things shows the pride that
Yes.
Satan has in the thought, how sure have I been that things
Exactly.
is going to happen that way. It doesn't.
Yes.
It's his own pride. So
Yes.
we see some of Satan there, his pridefulness coming against God. Those things.
Verse 22, in all this Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. I just want to focus on that for a second. So, I think we understand the idea of the sin. What's the charging God with wrong?
But he didn't say that, God has done this unjustly.
Okay, exactly. We charge God with wrong when we accuse God of injustice or evil. That's charging God with wrong. Now, I'm not sure whether I believe that that is a sin or not, because he talks about sin or charging God, as if they are two categories of responses. But it is different from a curse. How is that different from a curse? How is it different to curse God or to charge God with wrong?
It's the difference between a kid saying that punishment was unfair and a kid saying, I hate you, Dad.
All right, yes, I mean, I think, yes, that kind of gets to the heart of it. A curse is an expression coming out of anger and invoking harm or malice or evil against the one you're directing the curse to. And so someone is invoking harm and evil against God when we curse God. As compared to saying, God, you're unjust. This is not right. You're acting unjustly in this situation. Yes.
Because that's what the friends did.
Yes. Yeah. So we'll see all this. But I just wanted to make a distinction in our minds between cursing and charging God with wrong. And again, maybe you have a thought about whether it's a sin to charge God with wrong. I think on occasion we see some of God's people mistakenly, but not necessarily being condemned for charging God with wrong. And that may just be because God understands our limited comprehension about things, and I think we might see even that theme coming out in Job.
Jerry,
Yes.
I think about the Lord in Gethsemane in his prayer. He's not charging God with wrong, but he is. There is a sense in which he's asking questions
Yes.
about what is going on.
That's right, and I think we see those same kinds of attitudes with Job as well. Okay, so Satan comes before God a second time. There's another day, whatever that means. Again, I think our idea is that we're looking at something spiritual outside of time, but God is helping us connect what's going on in the spiritual realm, cause and effect. There are things happening in the spiritual world that are affecting things in the material world at a particular point in time. So that's perhaps one way to think about that. So what's different this time around? John?
Chapter 1, God said, do whatever you want to the things around Job, but don't touch Job himself. Now, Satan has permission to afflict Job, take away his health, and he covered him from head to toe with boils.
Okay. Before we get to that point, that's all correct. But there's something else that's different. Yes.
God's able to point to Job's reaction to his.
Yes. I think that's the first thing that we notice. God says he still holds fast to his integrity. He basically says, you know, your challenge failed because he didn't do, like someone said a moment ago, he absolutely completely wrong and slanderous about what Job would do. He then says, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. What do you understand by that?
It seems that in God's eyes, Job had done no wrong.
Okay? Yes, there is really no justification for what Satan wanted to do and tried to get Job to do. Absolutely no justification. There was no self-serving, sinful motive in the heart of Job.
Kind of a parallel passage would be Daniel, because he was blameless in every aspect of the government.
Okay.
Even the king realized that.
Okay. So, why have we got this statement from God? You incited me against him. Why have we got that in there?
Well, I think this sort of reminds us of Satan's very first accusation.
Yeah.
His whole thing, when he responds to God the first time, is, does he serve you for nothing?
Yes.
There's no reason he has to not serve you. He is everything, you know.
And it's this idea that it's Satan's evil motive that's at work here. It's not God doing any of this. God is not the one authoring this. It's not God's idea. It's all Satan. And I think it's important for us to see three things here. That God points out that Satan was wrong and that God was right all along. That there's no truth in the accusation. That Job was... his integrity was maintained and there was no self-serving motive here, and that it was Satan working and not God himself. So there's a second slander going on here. What's the second slander that Satan presents in these verses?
There's a challenge to strike at his health, and if that happens, then he will certainly
Yes.
curse.
Yeah. So this is an unusual term, skin for skin. What is that all about? What do you understand by that?
We say it different. We say we got no skin in the game.
Yeah, we do. What do we mean?
And just personal interest.
Okay. What's the kind of the essence of this skin for skin statement?
He seems to sort of be up in the ante. Yeah, all his stuff is gone. Most of his stuff is gone, I guess, as we've said. But nothing has touched Job personally, physically.
Okay. John?
That's another difference I see between chapter 1 and chapter 2. During this first challenge from Satan, he thought he was throwing everything he had at Job. But Job resisted it. Job remained faithful. Now Satan is saying, well, I sense frustration.
Okay.
I think Satan is frustrated because he thought he had done everything that he could possibly do, and still Job was good.
Okay. I think that's right. This is a bartering term, skin for skin. It's a bartering term. If we see it as a bartering term, what is that telling us? What is Satan really saying when he says this?
He will trade his behavior and his allegiance for his right to live, or his own ability to live. So he's trading his skin, his life,
Yes.
for his behavior.
Yeah. I think skin, sort of as Charles was saying there, skin stands for someone's life and the kind of their whole being. He is prepared, it seems to me, to see the loss of his children, the loss of his servants, as long as his own skin is saved. I think basically that's what Satan's accusation is, the slander. He didn't touch him, he came out of this alive. Remember, nothing has physically happened to him like right now. And as someone said, he's probably still got his home and maybe some of his farming and all that. But he's lost his children, his servants. But Satan's accusation is he's not going to care about that. He's got his own, he saved his own skin, basically. And so there's this other slander that comes, then you're going to harm him physically, then he's really going to reveal himself. And he's going to do something else. Satan says something about the way in which Job would approach God, in Satan's view anyway. What is that?
He'll curse you to your face.
Yeah, to your face. To your face. What does that mean?
There'll be no doubt.
All right.
It'll be a public thing.
Okay. Yeah, it's so direct. There's an impudence. There's an extra level of disrespect associated with doing it to your face. And again, it's this word bless that's being used here. Charles pointed out correctly last week that this word bless is translated curse. It's being used in a sarcastic kind of euphemistic way, and it's clear that that's how Satan is using it here, based on the to your face kind of extra element to this. And so just to wrap up today, we didn't finish lesson 2, we'll carry on. But to wrap up, Satan has acted in a two-step way, which I believe still is how he operates quite often. What is this two-step way that Satan has acted with regard to Job? Step number 1 was
Whereas all his stuff.
hurt him materially, make him resentful, make him discouraged in different ways, create a sort of psychological pain. And then hurt him physically, make him fearful, make him desperate, give him physical pain. It seems to me that Satan is upping the ante, as someone said, through this two-step approach. And that seems to be how he continues to operate. We can't get us with some kind of psychological pain. We're experiencing discouragement or resentment from loss and other things of that nature. He'll up the ante with potential physical harm to us. Okay, so that's where we're going to stop this morning. Thank you very much for your good comments, and we'll try and finish lesson 2 next week. I think we will, and we'll probably get into the lesson afterwards. Thank you so much.